The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain of the Arizona Territory. 1885. Thomas Callahan wiped sweat from his brow as he guided his horse along the rocky path toward home. 6 months had passed since he'd purchased the modest ranch nestled at the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains. The former cavalryman had sought solitude after years of military service, finding peace in the daily rhythms of cattle ranching and the vast, open landscape. Thomas pulled the reins, bringing his mare to a halt. Something had caught his attention, a faint trail of smoke rising in the distance, just beyond the narrow ravine that marked the eastern boundary of his property. Settlers were sparse in these parts, and Thomas knew the area was close to Apache territory. Relations between settlers and natives had been tense since General Crook's campaigns, with sporadic violence erupting despite peace treaties. "What do you think, Penny?" he murmured to his horse, who nickered softly in response. "Worth investigating." Curiosity and caution wrestled within him as he adjusted his worn Stetson and guided Penny toward the smoke. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they approached the creek that cut through the ravine. Thomas dismounted, leaving Penny to drink as he continued on foot, Winchester rifle held loosely in his weathered hands. The crack of gunfire shattered the silence. Thomas instinctively dropped to a crouch, scanning the terrain ahead. 3 more shots rang out, followed by shouts in English, rough, angry voices. Thomas moved quickly but cautiously through the brush until he reached a position overlooking a small clearing by the creek. 4 men, trail-worn and heavily armed, were advancing on a solitary figure pressed against a rocky outcrop. Even from a distance, Thomas recognized their quarry as an Apache woman. Blood darkened the sleeve of her buckskin dress, and she clutched a knife with fierce determination despite her obvious injury. "Nowhere left to run, Indian," one of the men called out, a cruel smile twisting his features. "You're going to pay for what your people did to my brother." Thomas's jaw tightened. He had no stake in this fight, and experience had taught him the dangers of interfering in matters between settlers and natives. But 4 armed men against a wounded woman struck him as the kind of cowardice he couldn't abide. "That's far enough," Thomas called out, stepping into view with his rifle raised. 4 against 1 seems hardly sporting, gentlemen. The men whirled around, weapons half raised before they registered Thomas's steady aim. "This ain't your business, stranger," the apparent leader spat. "This Apache bitch is part of the band that raided a homestead 3 days back. Killed 2 men. Thomas kept his expression neutral. "Be that as it may, I don't recall the territory appointing you judge and executioner." His eyes flicked briefly to the woman, who watched him with wary intensity. "Seems to me a wounded prisoner ought to be brought to Fort Bowie for proper justice." The leader's face darkened. "We know how that goes. Army'll just release her back to her people. We're settling this here and now." "Then we have a problem." Thomas shifted his stance slightly, keeping his rifle trained on the group. "Because I don't intend to witness a murder today." The tension stretched between them, sharp as a knife's edge. Thomas knew he was outnumbered, but something in his steady gaze, perhaps the look of a man who had seen his share of violence and wasn't afraid of more, gave the men pause. The standoff broke when one of the men, younger and more impulsive than the others, raised his pistol with a curse. Thomas fired a warning shot that kicked up dirt at the man's feet. "Next one won't miss," Thomas said quietly. What followed was a brief, chaotic exchange of gunfire. Thomas ducked behind a boulder as bullets splintered bark from nearby trees. He returned fire carefully, aiming to disable rather than kill. 1 man fell, clutching his leg with a howl of pain. Another took a shot that grazed his shoulder before the remaining 2 decided the wounded Apache wasn't worth their lives. "You're making a mistake," the leader shouted as they retreated, dragging their injured companion. "You're siding with savages." Only when their voices faded did Thomas approach the Apache woman, hands raised to show he meant no harm. She remained tense, knife still gripped tightly despite the blood seeping through her sleeve. "I'm not going to hurt you," Thomas said softly, "but that wound needs tending, and those men might come back with more." For a long moment, she simply stared at him, dark eyes assessing. Then, with a slight nod, she lowered her knife. Thomas didn't know it yet, But this moment of humanity would change the course of his solitary life forever. The journey back to Thomas's ranch was slow and tense. He had offered his horse to the wounded woman, but she had refused, preferring to walk despite her injury. Thomas respected her pride, keeping pace beside her while maintaining a respectful distance. Penny followed behind, reins loose in Thomas's hand. "My name's Thomas Callahan," he offered as they crested a small rise overlooking his property. A modest cabin with a sturdy barn and corral nestled against the backdrop of distant mountains. "My ranch is just ahead. We can tend to that wound there." The woman glanced at him, her expression guarded. "Najoni," she finally said, the word emerging reluctantly. Thomas nodded, recognizing it as her name. He knew little of the Apache language beyond what he'd picked up during his cavalry days, but he understood the importance of names. They were the beginning of seeing someone as human. The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin. Thomas helped Najoni onto the porch before taking Penny to the barn for a quick rub-down and feed. When he returned, he found Najoni exactly where he'd left her, as if uncertain of her welcome despite his invitation. "Come inside," Thomas said, opening the door. "I have supplies to clean that wound." The interior of the cabin was simple but neat. A main room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn table and chairs, a small kitchen area, and a curtained-off sleeping space. Thomas moved efficiently, lighting lamps and stoking the bank fire before retrieving a wooden box containing medical supplies. "Army taught me basic field medicine," he explained, setting a pot of water to boil. "Not as good as a doctor, but I can clean and bandage well enough." Najoni watched his movements with calculated intensity. Thomas recognized the look. He'd worn it himself in enemy territory, constantly assessing, planning, ready for danger. He moved deliberately, explaining each action before he took it. "I need to see the wound," he said, gesturing to her blood-soaked sleeve. After a moment's hesitation, Najoni shifted the buckskin garment to expose a deep gash along her upper arm. Thomas winced at the sight. "Bullet grazed you good. Lucky it didn't hit bone." Working carefully, he cleaned the wound with boiled water and whiskey, noting how Najoni barely flinched despite what must have been considerable pain. As he wrapped clean bandages around her arm, he broke the silence. "Those men said something about a raid. That true?" Najoni's eyes flashed. "White men lie. They crossed boundary, killed 2 hunters. We defended." Thomas nodded slowly. It was a familiar story in the territory, both sides claiming the other had struck first, with truth usually lost somewhere in between. What mattered to him was that 4 armed men pursuing 1 wounded woman wasn't justice by any measure. "You have family?" he asked, securing the bandage. "People who'll be looking for you?" "My father is war chief," she replied, a hint of pride entering her voice. "Nakayes. My brother, Tarak, leads warriors. They will search." Thomas felt a chill at this information. Harboring the daughter of an Apache war chief could bring complications he hadn't anticipated. Yet sending her back into the wilderness, wounded and with those men possibly still hunting her, wasn't an option his conscience would allow. "You can stay here tonight," he decided. "Tomorrow, if you're strong enough, I can take you closer to your people's territory." Najoni studied him, confusion evident in her features. "Why you help? You are blue coat." Thomas corrected. "Now I'm just a rancher, and helping a wounded woman seemed the right thing to do, Apache or not." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Thomas moved quickly to the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. 6 riders approached his property, torches illuminating hard faces and raised weapons. "Looks like your friends found us," Thomas muttered grimly, reaching for his rifle. Najoni joined him at the window, her body tensing at the sight. Not just those men, others too. Thomas recognized the leader from the earlier confrontation, but the others were strangers, likely recruited from nearby settlements or mining camps, men eager for what they would call justice and others might call vengeance. "Callahan," a voice bellowed from beyond the fence line. "Send out the Apache woman and we'll leave you be. Harbor her, and we'll consider you an Indian lover." Thomas checked his ammunition, mind racing through options. His cabin was sturdy, built to withstand both weather and potential attacks, but 6 armed men presented steep odds. "They will burn your home," Najoni said quietly. "Give me to them. I die fighting." Thomas shook his head. "Nobody's dying tonight if I can help it." He met her gaze steadily. "I gave you my protection. That means something where I come from." As the riders approached the fence line, Thomas made his decision. He would stand his ground, defending a woman he barely knew against men of his own kind, because sometimes, he reflected, principles were all a man had left when everything else was stripped away. A tense night followed. Thomas had positioned himself and Najoni strategically. He at the front window with his Winchester, she at the side with his old cavalry pistol. The riders had withdrawn after their initial challenge, setting up camp just beyond rifle range. Occasionally, a bottle passed between them, their voices carrying through the still desert air. "They wait for morning," Najoni observed, her voice low. "Attack with sun behind them." Thomas nodded. It was a sound tactical approach. They'd have the advantage of light, while he'd be struggling to see. "You know their ways well." "I know war," she replied simply. "My father taught all his children, daughters too. Said knowledge keeps us alive." As the night deepened, Thomas learned more about Najoni through their whispered conversations. She was 22 summers old, unmarried by choice despite being the daughter of an important chief. Her name meant beautiful in the Apache language, though she spoke of it with characteristic modesty. Her people, the Chiricahua Apache, had managed to maintain some independence, despite the increasing pressure from white settlers and the U.S. Army. In turn, Thomas shared pieces of his own story, his Irish immigrant parents, his 5 years in the cavalry before disillusionment set in, his dream of building something of his own in this harsh but magnificent landscape. There was an unexpected ease to their exchange. 2 people from vastly different worlds finding common ground in their respect for the land and their principles. "Why did you leave Blue Coats?" she asked during a lull in their vigil. Thomas was silent for a long moment. Saw things done in the name of progress that didn't sit right. Following orders is simple until they ask you to do something you can't live with after. Najoni nodded, understanding in her eyes. "My father says same of some young warriors. Hot blood makes bad choices." As dawn approached, Thomas offered Najoni food, jerky, hardtack, and strong coffee. They ate in silence, both aware of what the coming light would bring. "If things go badly," Thomas said quietly, "there's a trapdoor under the rug by the hearth. Leads to a root cellar. Previous owner dug it deep enough to hide in." Najoni's expression hardened. "I do not hide." "Not asking you to run," Thomas clarified. "Just giving you options. Sometimes living to fight another day is the braver choice." The first golden rays of sunlight had just crested the eastern mountains when Thomas spotted movement. The men were spreading out, taking positions behind his water trough, the woodpile, and the corner of the barn. "Callahan," came the leader's voice. "Last chance to send her out." Thomas drew a deep breath. "And I told you last night, Jenkins, that's not happening. You boys turn around and ride out, and we'll forget this happened." His response was met with angry mutters. Thomas glanced at Najoni, who had positioned herself with remarkable steadiness despite her injury. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The first shot splintered the window frame inches from Thomas's head. He returned fire, aiming for the water trough where Jenkins had taken cover. For several minutes, the exchange continued, measured, deliberate shots rather than wild firing, as both sides conserved ammunition. Thomas was reloading when a burning torch arced through the air, landing on the porch with a shower of sparks. Another followed, this one striking the roof. "Damn it," Thomas muttered, moving quickly to the bucket of water he'd prepared. He doused the flames on the porch through a gap in the shuttered window, but the roof was beyond his reach. Najoni moved to his side. "Fire will spread," she said urgently. "We must." Her words were cut short by the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, not from the direction of Jenkins and his men, but from the east. Thomas risked a glance and felt his breath catch. At least 15 mounted Apache warriors were charging toward his ranch, their faces painted for battle weapons raised. "Your people?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. Njoni's expression transformed, relief and pride washing over her features. "My brother found us." Jenkins and his men had clearly not anticipated this development. Their shouts of alarm carried clearly as they scrambled for their horses. Two never made it. Precise shots from the approaching warriors dropped them where they stood. The others managed to mount up, fleeing westward with the Apache in close pursuit. One rider broke from the main group, approaching the cabin directly. Unlike the others, his face bore no war paint, and the feathers adorning his hair marked him as someone of importance. "My brother, Tarak," Njoni explained, moving toward the door. Thomas hesitated, rifle still in hand. He'd just survived one siege. He wasn't eager to face another, even if Njoni seemed confident in their safety. "Will they understand?" he asked, the question encompassing a world of uncertainty. Njoni turned to him, her expression solemn. "You saved the daughter of a war chief. They will understand honor, even from a white man." As Thomas followed her onto the porch, the fire on his roof now extinguished by warriors who had circled behind during the confrontation, he couldn't help but wonder if his simple act of humanity was about to change not just his life, but perhaps, in some small way, the understanding between two peoples who had seen each other as enemies for too long. Thomas stood on his porch, Winchester held non-threateningly at his side as Tarak dismounted. The Apache warrior moved with fluid grace, his features bearing a striking resemblance to Njoni's, the same high cheekbones and intense, evaluating gaze. Unlike his sister, however, Tarak's expression remained impassive as Njoni spoke rapidly to him in their native tongue. Thomas caught fragments of their conversation, his name, mentions of the ambush, the men who had pursued them. Occasionally, Tarak's eyes flicked toward Thomas, measuring him with each glance. Other warriors had formed a protective perimeter around the property, some still mounted while others had taken positions that provided clear sight lines in all directions. Finally, Tarak approached Thomas. "My sister says you fought your own kind to protect her," he said in accented but clear English. "Those men were my kind," Thomas responded evenly. "Not in any way that matters." A flicker of something, perhaps respect, crossed Tarak's features. "She says you were Blue Coat." Thomas nodded. "Fifth Cavalry." "Not anymore." "Why did you help her?" The directness of the question matched Thomas's own sensibilities. "Because it was right. 4 armed men hunting one wounded woman isn't justice, it's murder." Tarak considered this, then extended his hand in the white man's custom. "My people owe you a debt, Thomas Callahan." The gesture surprised Thomas, but he clasped the offered hand firmly. As they broke the handshake, a commotion arose from the western perimeter. 3 warriors were returning, bringing with them a bound prisoner, Jenkins, his face bloodied and defiant despite his circumstances. "This one led the others," Tarak explained, his voice hardening. "The others escaped or died fighting." Jenkins spat on the ground when he saw Thomas. "Traitorous bastard, siding with savages against your own people." Thomas felt a cold anger rise within him. "Those savages showed more honor than you and your lynch mob." Tarak observed the exchange silently before turning to Thomas. "By our law, his life is forfeit. He hunted my sister like an animal." Thomas tensed. He had intervened to prevent one killing. He wasn't eager to bear witness to another, even if Jenkins deserved punishment. And by territorial law, he should face a judge for attempted murder. The moment stretched between them, a test of the fragile understanding they had just established. Finally, Tarak nodded. "My father would speak with the man who saved his daughter. He would hear this story from both your lips. If you agree, we will take this prisoner to Fort Bowie on our way." The proposal caught Thomas off guard. Entering an Apache camp voluntarily wasn't something many white men would consider, particularly a former cavalry soldier. Yet the invitation represented something rare and valuable, a chance for genuine understanding rather than the suspicion that had defined relations between their peoples. "I'll need to secure my property first," Thomas said, making his decision, "and tend to my livestock." Tarak nodded. "We will help. Then we ride before midday." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Thomas was struck by the efficiency with which the Apache warriors assisted him, reinforcing his damaged roof, securing windows, and even helping with his small herd of cattle. They worked largely in silence, but the absence of hostility spoke volumes. Najoni, despite Thomas's insistence that she rest, helped prepare provisions for the journey. He found her in his kitchen, wrapping jerky and hardtack in oilcloth. "Your brother seems like a good man," Thomas observed, filling canteens with fresh water. Najoni nodded. "He is wise beyond his years. Our father's strength with our mother's heart." She paused, looking directly at Thomas. "You are nervous to come to our camp." It wasn't a question. Thomas saw no point in denying it. "Let's just say I've heard stories." "As we have heard stories of bluecoats," she countered. "Some true, some not. Better to see with your own eyes, yes?" By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. Thomas rode Penny, while Jenkins was secured on a spare horse, flanked by warriors. Turok led the procession eastward, into territory Thomas had observed from a distance, but never entered. As they rode, Thomas found himself riding alongside Najoni. "Your father, will he welcome a former soldier?" Najoni considered the question seriously. "My father is War Chief Nakayes, but he is first a father. You save his daughter. He will listen before he judges." After a pause, she added, "And I will speak for you." Thomas nodded, oddly comforted by her assurance. The landscape grew increasingly rugged as they traveled deeper into Apache territory. Thomas noted how the warriors used natural features for cover, how they communicated with subtle hand signals, and how they constantly scanned their surroundings. These were the tactics that had made the Apache formidable opponents during his military days. By late afternoon, they crested a ridge overlooking a hidden valley, where a village of Wickiups stood clustered beside a clear stream. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and children paused in their play to watch the returning warriors. At the edge of the settlement, a group of elders had already gathered, clearly alerted to their approach by scouts. "My home," Najoni said simply, a note of pride in her voice. Thomas straightened in his saddle, aware that he was about to cross a threshold few white men had crossed willingly, and fewer still had returned from to tell the tale. The arrival at the Apache camp was a solemn procession. Warriors who had ridden ahead announced their approach, and by the time Thomas rode in with Turok and Najoni, the entire community had assembled. Women, children, and elders stood in clustered groups, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility at the sight of a white man entering their sanctuary. Jenkins was taken immediately to a guarded wickiup at the camp's edge. Thomas dismounted slowly, conscious of dozens of eyes tracking his every movement. A tall, distinguished man with gray streaking his long black hair stepped forward from the group of elders. Even without introduction, Thomas recognized Nakayes, the proud bearing, the commanding presence, and the unmistakable resemblance to both Turok and Najoni marked him clearly as their father. Najoni approached her father first, embracing him briefly before speaking rapidly in their language. The war chief listened intently, his expression revealing nothing as his gaze occasionally shifted to Thomas. When she finished, Nakayes approached Thomas with measured steps. "My daughter says you faced your own people's bullets to shield her," he said, his English precise despite its accent. "Why would a blue coat do this?" Thomas met the chief's gaze directly. "I'm not a soldier anymore, sir. Just a rancher trying to live by a code that says you don't stand by when the strong prey on the vulnerable." Nakayes studied him silently, as if searching for deception in Thomas's features. Finally, he nodded once. "Tonight, we will hear the full story. Both sides. Then we decide what must be done with the prisoner, and how to honor our debt to you." The remainder of the afternoon passed in a strange limbo. Thomas was given water and food, but remained conscious of being an outsider under watchful eyes. Children especially seemed fascinated by him, peeking from behind wickiups or their mothers' skirts. He caught glimpses of Najoni moving through the camp, stopping often to embrace friends and family members who clearly had feared for her safety. As dusk approached, a large fire was built in the center of the camp. The community gathered in concentric circles around it, with the elders seated closest to the flames. Thomas was directed to sit in a position of honor, across from Nakias, while Jenkins was brought forward under guard, his hands still bound though his face had been cleaned. Tarak stood and addressed the gathering in Apache before switching to English. "We meet to hear truth and decide justice. Speak clear words, speak true words." What followed was unlike any trial Thomas had witnessed. Najoni spoke first, recounting the ambush by the creek. Thomas was called upon next, describing how he had intervened and the subsequent siege at his ranch. Throughout his account, the assembly remained silent, though he could feel their intense focus on every word. When Jenkins's turn came, his defiance had diminished somewhat in the face of the solemn gathering. "They raided the Henderson place," he insisted. "Killed 2 men, stole livestock." An older warrior stood, speaking in Apache while Tarak translated. 3 days ago, 4 young men from Henderson's ranch crossed our hunting grounds. They shot 2 of our hunters, without warning. When we pursued them, they fled to their homestead. We recovered our dead and took only the horses that were rightfully ours in payment for the lives taken. As the testimonies continued, Thomas began to understand the complex web of grievances and retaliations that had ensnared both communities. Neither side was blameless, but neither was as guilty as the other believed. The tragedy lay in how few opportunities existed for the kind of exchange happening now, where truth could be spoken and heard by both sides. When all had spoken, Nakayes rose slowly to his feet. The firelight cast deep shadows across his weathered features as he addressed the gathering. "The prisoner sought vengeance without truth. This leads always to more bloodshed." He turned to Jenkins. "By our law, your life is forfeit. But Thomas Callahan has asked that you face the white man's justice instead." His gaze shifted to Thomas. "We will honor this request. Tomorrow, warriors will take you to Fort Bowie to answer for your crimes." Jenkins sagged in relief, though he avoided Thomas's eyes. Nakayes continued, now addressing Thomas directly. "You stood between my daughter and death. You opened your home to her when she was hunted. The Chiricahua do not forget such debts." He gestured, and an elderly woman came forward bearing a beautifully crafted leather pouch decorated with intricate beadwork. "This medicine bag contains sacred items of protection," Nakayes explained as the pouch was presented to Thomas. "It marks you as a friend of our people. From this day, you may pass in our territory without fear. Your home and your herd will be respected." Thomas accepted the gift with appropriate solemnity. "I'm honored by your trust." As the formal proceedings concluded, the atmosphere in the camp gradually relaxed. Food was shared, and despite language barriers, Thomas found himself welcomed into conversations through Najoni's translations. Children who had hidden earlier now approached openly, fascinated by his red hair and beard. Later, as Thomas prepared to sleep in the guest wickiup provided for him, Najoni visited briefly. "My father says you may return to your ranch tomorrow if you wish," she informed him. "Warriors will escort you safely." Thomas nodded. "Thank you. Though I admit, I've learned more about your people in one day than in all my years in the territory." Najoni smiled, the first full smile he had seen from her. "Perhaps this is just the beginning of understanding between our peoples." As she left, Thomas contemplated the strange turn his solitary life had taken. A single act of decency had forged connections he never expected. Though the challenges between their communities remained substantial, tonight had shown that common ground could be found when people chose to see the humanity in one another. A small circle of firelight pushing back against the darkness of prejudice and fear.